Hi, gang. Sorry I can't be here. By now, Mrs. Pash has already carried you through the first part of class. You've shared in groups with your e-learning day activity. Thanks for doing that. I wanted to hit on questions 1, 2, and 8 really fast. We'll circle back tomorrow when I'm in class and talk about the other ones briefly. I am looking forward to hearing your commonplace quotes from the Saul McLeod piece that you read for Wednesday. We will get to those things, be assured. The first thing that's interesting about your e-learning was how Milgram varied up his experiment. He was testing the theory that people administering the shocks were actually sadistic monsters. Like they had been given this opportunity, a golden opportunity from this experiment to just zap dudes and have fun doing it because, hey, I was just following orders from the guy in a gray lab coat. What a great day. So to test for that, he allowed the people to choose their own voltage levels. And when he did that test 40 times, he found that 38 of the 40 stayed well below lethal levels of shock value. And those 38 stopped as soon as they were hearing any amount of shouting or screaming from the guy in the other room. So that reinforces the idea that people following orders were not sadistic monsters. They were just normal, ordinary people. And that's where this other concept of the banality of evil comes into play. And I want you to remember Hannah Arendt, even though she's not an author in this textbook. Hannah Arendt coins the phrase the banality of evil in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And students in the past have really latched onto that one as a commonplace quote of help for this unit. The word banality is such a weird word. It just means ordinary and everyday. And the two questions you had on your study guide talk about what does that mean? So, the perception of Nazi officers as monsters, akin to Hannibal Lecter, who enjoy killing and elevate it to this form of art, while doing it, is definitely a perception people had of people who were responsible for the Holocaust. But in reality, when Hannah Arendt sat down with Eichmann and listened to what he was saying, she ran against that perception and said he was really just an ordinary guy carrying out orders at a desk, sending letters, telegrams, communiques throughout German high command. In reality, Eichmann was one of the highest ranking officers in Hitler's inner circle, and he had helped become one of the architects of the final solution to exterminate the Jews, but he was merely in charge of the logistics when the plan shifted from immigrating Jews to ghettos to exterminating them in camps. He oversaw, the deportations and the incarcerations and the murders. It was his job to make sure that the trains were packed and always sending Jews to the camps, and that the camps were meeting their monthly quotas of death in the gas chambers and the crematoriums and such. So he very much had a role, but it's really interesting to hear his own words. This is what he said while on trial in Jerusalem in 1960. He said, "There is no need to draw a line between the leaders responsible and the people like me forced to serve as mere instruments in the hands of leaders. I was not a responsible leader, and as such do not feel myself guilty." I find that amazing. I do not find myself guilty. He saw himself as just another guy carrying out orders, somebody higher up than himself who was making reasonable requests. The Jewish High Court felt otherwise, and obviously they hanged him. But the conclusion from Arendt and many others is that, evil is ordinary and mundane, and it is not the work of the monstrous few, that anybody is in fact capable of that. Which leads us to a really interesting question. The last one you did for your e-learning day was question number 8, where you had to encapsulate what Milgram says in paragraphs 113 and 114. If you still have that rack book with you, why don't you go to page 85 with me. Correction, let's go to page 89. Here's the interesting passage. We want to look at it and really break it down. One of the things Milgram writes is about the division of labor. And he said, this may illustrate a dangerously typical arrangement in a complex society. It is easy to ignore responsibility when one is only an intermediate link in a chain of action. Yeah, that idea of, well, I was just a chain in an overall link. How big was my role in all of this? He expands on that. He talks about the problem of obedience is not wholly psychological. It's also dealing with the form and the shape of society, and the way it develops has much to do with it. So it's not just about stuff up here, it's about the overall structure in which somebody finds themselves. So that's interesting. Just the idea that people might be enabled to do evil not because of something up here, but because of the way society structures itself. He writes, as soon as there was a division of labor, things changed. Beyond a certain point, the breaking up of society into people carrying out narrow and very special jobs takes away from the human quality of work and life. A person does not get to see the whole situation, but only a small part of it, and is thus unable to act without some kind of overall direction. It's a long quote from page 89, but it probably is something you want to get down. Just this idea that people can really do a lot of evil when they are just part of a larger chain of actions. You know, obviously you can apply this back into the Holocaust. Who was responsible for the 8 million to 10 million deaths? You can lay that right at the feet of Hitler and his officers who were the designers and devisers of this evil plan. Or you could say it's the commandants of each individual death camp throughout Europe. But, I mean, if you take this theory that everybody who plays a chain in that, a link in that chain is responsible, then you got to say, what about the concentration camp guard? What about the person who drove the train to get the Jews there? What about the person who turned the lever in the chamber that released the Zyklon B? What about the police officers who rounded up the Jews in hiding and made sure they got on the trains? What about the teacher who was teaching Nazi propaganda to children? All of them are part of that chain. All of them share responsibility, and that really is the truly unsettling thing. And the overall point Milgram is trying to get to. While we did win World War II and the Germans were brought to justice for what they did in the Holocaust, the warning remains. People are people and obviously capable of doing some of these things given the right set of circumstances. This is the subject of tonight's reading, which you will get started on here in class. The difference with this upcoming reading, it deals with something that American soldiers did back in the Vietnam War. But the My Lai massacre, I'll tell you more about next.